Dr. Mark Changizi here with your Science Moment. Today I'm going to talk about, would it be okay to do all of these interventions, lockdowns, let's set it up here a little bit, lockdowns and masks and shutdowns and school closures and vaccine mandates and banishing the unvaccinated from society and firing them. Would it have been okay to do all of these things if it hadn't been relatively mild COVID? Which was just a little bit worse than flu, the average flu for those that are older, and much safer than flu for those that are younger. If it had instead been like Ebola, but not just like Ebola, but like had the transmissibility of measles, say, then Andrew Lilico said, and then it would obviously be justified to do all of these things. And even Elon Musk, who's semi-team reality, off and on, sort of inconsistently, says, yeah, it would definitely then be justified. Now, this is a huge mistake. This is misunderstanding the moral of the last 3 years. And by the way, we are basically at 3 years into this COVID debacle as of today, March 7th or so. All right? This is to completely misunderstand the last 3 years. Now, first thing that you might want to say to yourself is that we actually did think this time that the infection fatality rate was 40%. That is, they did not everybody in different places, but they thought that it was often 100 to 500 times higher than it actually was. For example, in an Australian poll, the average respondent thought that the infection fatality rate of COVID was 38%, not 3.8%, not 0.38%, still too high, right? But 38%, that means that they thought that of those who caught the virus, 38% died, right? In the United States and many other countries, even as of the summer of 2020, the average respondent thought that 9% of the entire population was already dead from COVID, right? If you were to be in a future situation where the supposed pandemic at a 40% IFR and people were dying like crazy, well, why should you believe it? Right? What happens when there's panic and fear and collective hysteria? Do exaggerations ever go negatively? Do they ever go down? No, they only go up, right? In this case, they went up by 2 or 3 orders of magnitude from where the data actually were. So if you were to hear these massive numbers, why on earth should you believe them? And why on earth, after 3 years of 2 to 3 orders of magnitude exaggeration of the risks, should you believe that you're in a situation that's any different than it was this last time, right? Now, setting all that aside in terms of your, whether you really believe that it was as dangerous as, let's suppose it really was, right? Well, we already know that lockdowns don't work. We knew that they didn't work, but before COVID, it was standard practice. Standard practice was that you should never do lockdowns. You should never quarantine the healthy, right? That this won't work. And in fact, now we've got 3 years of data because there's tremendous variability from country to country, from county to county, from city to city. There's tremendous spatial variability in terms of how hard the intervention stringency was. How stringent were they? And there's no correlation with intervention stringency and pandemic severity. In fact, in some cases, there's negative correlations, which means the more stringent the interventions, the more excess deaths there were, right? Which I'll get to in just a moment, more on that. They didn't correlate. And then places like Sweden have done incredibly well, right? They were predicted to be just, a debacle there. No, they've done incredibly well. All of the data that we have just reconfirms what the standard practice was as of 2019. Don't do lockdowns because they don't even narrowly slow transmission. So why, if it suddenly becomes a much more dangerous virus, would you suddenly do exactly what we know doesn't work? How does that make any sense at all, right? Now, furthermore, lockdowns not only don't slow transmission, but they had tremendous harms, right? They had tremendous harms. They had economic harms. I talk about these things in many long, depressing threads. They had tremendous effects pushing the developing world back a decade or two. And I had another science moment just about this. And they had tremendous lockdown and hysteria deaths, which we've also talked about. That the initial first spike, and many since then, of these excess deaths are due to the panicked change in medical practice and change in societal practice in terms of how people went, where they were sent, how likely they were to go to the hospital if they were sick. All of these excess deaths are because of the interventions, right? Economic damage, developing world damage, actual lives damaged, lives lost by virtue of the intervention. So why would you want to use interventions and other restrictions that didn't work and only had massive harms just because it's a more dangerous thing? No, you don't use ineffective, harmful things more strongly just because it's a more dangerous source, right? Now, as irrational as it is, I think there's some intuition people have. Well, we would just have to do it harder. No, we know that there's all this variability in intervention stringency, and it did not lead to any benefit in terms of the pandemic. It only caused harms. Right? Remember, the greatest threat to societies aren't all of these kinds of risks that cause people to panic. They're exactly the things that we do when we're afraid, and we do them quickly. Emergencies and civil liberties violations justified by emergencies are our greatest emergency. Right? Never forget that. And that was your science moment. If you're interested in understanding free expression, freedom, civil liberties, collective hysteria, and the kinds of emergent processes and the kind of evolutionary processes that you really have to understand what's been happening to us for 3 years, follow me on Twitter, subscribe to this channel, go check us out at the Free Expression Research Institute, freex.group. Support us. We are one of the few institutes that are studying these societal dynamics and these modern ways that come from complexity theory and cognitive science and psychology.